Okay, with the Paris Olympic closing ceremony taking place this evening for the Olympic Games in 2024, let's go back in time to 1976 to another French-speaking Olympics in Montreal, which was a disaster. Now, the Paris Olympics has had some controversy. Every Olympics has some controversy, but the Montreal Olympics was exceptionally controversial. Exceptionally controversial. More to do with the cost and the legacy. It's not a well remembered Olympics. It's not fondly remembered by people in the province of Quebec, in the city of Montreal, and in Canada in general. It's not looked upon very favourably. The two Winter Olympics Canada's hosted in '88 and 2010 in Calgary and Vancouver are favourably remembered by the athletes that took part, the fans who watched, and the cities that hosted them. But Montreal, this had economic consequences for 30 years for the city of Montreal and the province of Quebec. There was political consequences. It was a disaster politically. And some of the facilities weren't actually finished until 1987, and we'll talk about that. But let's go back in time to 1970, when Montreal is awarded the Games by the IOC. They beat out LA and Moscow. Moscow would host the next Olympics in 1980, and LA would host in 1984. Now, LA will be hosting the next Olympics in 2028. And when LA hosted the Games in '84, the cost overruns from Montreal and the national boycotts and all the construction issues, LA basically said, we're going to reuse as many facilities that we already have existing in Los Angeles as possible, very similar to what they're doing now. They're trying to be very, very cost conscious. Talking about the budget overruns, they had 6 years to get all the facilities ready. One of the facilities wasn't actually finished until 1987. So in London, we have the Olympic kind of tower outside the old Olympic Stadium, which is now the London Stadium. Montreal had something similar. It wasn't completed until 1987, and we'll discuss that later. So yeah, some of the facilities weren't completed for 11 more years. Now, awarded the Games in 1970, but very, very quickly it became very, very obvious there was a lot of labour unrest in Canada. And in the 70s, across the world, there was economic issues. You've had two oil crises in the 70s, the 73 and 79 oil crisis, which impacted oil prices. There was a lot of deindustrialisation, so the former heavy industries are being wound down. And there's a lot of unemployment. And that impacted the construction industry. And, budget, over budget. Oh, very much over budget. 7 times over budget. 720% over the planned budget. In 2015 dollars, it would have cost $6.1 billion to host the Games if it was hosted in 2015 or 2016. Today, that we're talking about $7, potentially even $8 billion to get this Games hosted. So it was very, very expensive. It went massively over budget. And that was just on the construction costs. That's not even on the hosting costs and the administration and the logistics of getting athletes to and from the athletes' village and getting the fans in. So the costs ballooned very, very quickly. There was a lot of strikes. Now, Andre Dede Desjardins was the main union leader in Quebec, in Montreal, with the construction companies. And it involved politicians. The mayor tried to come to a negotiation with the unions. The regional premier in the province of Quebec eventually did manage to break the deadlock between the unions and the union leader Andre Dede Desjardins, and getting the Games completed. The Quebec government ended up taking over construction in 1975, and there were a lot of concerns that none of the facilities would be ready for the opening ceremony. And we'll talk about how some of the facilities are still having issues today. Also, the national boycotts. Now, Taiwan, Republic of China, if you know your Chinese history, mainland China is the communist bit, and Taiwan, or Taipei, or Chinese Taipei, is the nationalist bit. Obviously, they fought their civil war. Neither side recognises each other. They both claim each other's territory. Political dispute. Chinese Taipei didn't compete, in part because Canada had recognised the People's Republic of China in 1970, the year they were awarded the Games. There was a political boycott by Taiwan. 28 other nations boycotted, 2 for economic reasons, but basically most of Africa boycotted because New Zealand, the All Blacks, had toured South Africa to play the Springboks, and that was in the backdrop with the apartheid saga. Now, South Africa have been banned from international competition since the mid-60s because of their apartheid policy by the white minority government, and many nations went, we're boycotting, which was quite kind of embarrassing. So massive national boycotts. We would see boycotts in Moscow and in LA as well, with the Soviets and the US tit for tat over the invasion of Afghanistan that would take place in 1979. But this was unprecedented number of nations boycotting. Some actually did it for economic reasons. They could not afford to go. It was too expensive, and the backdrop of economic uncertainty, recessions and high unemployment around the world, and the oil crisis of 73 had a knock-on impact for economies around the world. So some nations didn't go. They couldn't afford to. And this runs into how we've got cost overruns here. Now, the stadium issues were ongoing. The retractable roof never worked properly. And then we're talking about the legacy. So we're talking about the legacy of the games. And this is where I think the games aren't fondly remembered. So we've got these cost overruns in construction, infrastructure, getting the facilities ready. And as I say, the Montreal Tower wasn't completed until 1987. Think of it like the London Olympic Village with the Olympic Tower, kind of weird spire tourist attraction outside the stadium. That was completed on time. It's still used today. People still go up the tower to look at the Olympic Park and have views across London. The Montreal equivalent took 11 years after the games were over. So in total, 17 years from getting the games to completing this thing. It wasn't ready for the Olympics. Fans and tourists couldn't go up the tower to view across the Montreal skyline and the Olympic Park. That's embarrassing when one of the facilities, one of the cornerstones of the Olympic Park, wasn't completed for the games and wasn't completed for a further 11 years. That is embarrassing. The stadium, the retractable roof, never worked. It had constant problems. Now, talking about the legacy, the debt for the games wasn't paid off by the City of Montreal until 2006. It took 30 years to clear what is now, in today's money, around $6 to $8 billion. It took 30 years to pay off that debt, which had an impact for people in Montreal and for taxpayers in the province of Quebec. It had a massive economic impact for people in that part of Canada. Massive overruns, and I think there was even some federal government money that needed to be paid back as well. So it did have an economic negative impact where public services were impacted, funding for schools, police, fire services, transportation. Your general public services was impacted by the fact that the state, or the provincial and city government, had to pay off this debt for 30 years. The stadium doesn't actually have a permanent tenant. So the Alouettes, who play in the CFL, have moved out. The Montreal Expos have moved out. Montreal's club football, play in the MLS, don't play there permanently. There is no permanent tenant. The Montreal Expos left over 20 years ago. They relocated to Washington, D.C. And in part of that was the stadium issues. The stadium was a massive stadium. It didn't work for baseball, but the constant having to shut the stadium down for repairs and refurbishment because the roof didn't work impacted the Montreal Expos. A lot of baseball fans feel that's one of the reasons why the Expos moved. Partly there were some economic issues as well, but the stadium doesn't have a permanent anchor tenant. No major league plays there. It's a white elephant, and it's been a white elephant for a very, very long time. 48 years. It has been a drain on the City of Montreal, paying for its upkeep when there is no permanent tenant, and there hasn't been for a very, very long time. Talking about the Montreal Tower, as I say, very similar to the London Tower that we have outside the London City Stadium. The spire, it looks like an Olympic flame. That was ready on time. People can still go in there today. It's a tourist attraction. It's not the most profitable tourist attraction, but you pay to go up it. You go up and you have a view across London and the Olympic Park. The Montreal equivalent, as I say, was not completed until 11 years after the Olympics had been and gone. So you can see where I'm going with this. As I say, the games wasn't fully paid off, and they're still building this tower for a large portion of that. The Quebec government had to step in with the strikes led by André Desjardins. The Montreal and Quebec government, so the local city government and the provincial government, had to step in and take over construction from the private contractors. It was not going to get completed. There were private talks between the mayor of Montreal and the Quebec premier and the federal prime minister, Trudeau. Ironically, there's a Trudeau prime minister of Canada now, his son. They all tried to basically have talks with the union leader, Desjardins, and the other union members as well, to basically figure out a way around the strikes and the labour unrest. And they were still basically building facilities days, hours before the opening ceremony, similar to Athens in 2004, which wasn't completed on time. Talking about the legacy now, the Olympic Park, you've got this white elephant of a stadium. The only sporting event that regularly goes to Montreal is the Canadian Grand Prix, and that is a racetrack built around the old Olympic Park. It wasn't there originally. That wasn't the original plan. There were other motor racing circuits in Canada that hosted the F1 and other motor racing events before the current Gilles Villeneuve circuit was put in place as a street circuit. And it's a great Grand Prix to watch. It's a fantastic Grand Prix. The fans are brilliant. The racing's brilliant. But that is the only positive Olympic legacy I can think of for the Olympic Park in Montreal. Beset by problems, the cost. And a lot of Canadians, not just in Montreal and Quebec, but a lot of Canadians have a very dim view of the 76 Olympics. In complete contrast to Calgary in 88 with the Winter Olympics and Vancouver in 2010, which were very, very positive. And a lot of fans have very positive views about those games, at the Winter Games. This Summer Olympics was the first and only time Canada has ever hosted a Summer Olympic Games. I don't think any Canadian city puts their hand up and says, yeah, we want to have a Summer Olympics again. Because the Summer Olympics is far bigger than the Winter Olympics and costs a lot more to put on and host. I don't think Canada puts its hand up for another Summer Olympics. I think there's still a lot of feeling with Canadian sports fans and the Canadian public that it was a waste of money. And it didn't. It's not a memorable games for all the right reasons. When we talk about the 76 Montreal Olympics, it's largely forgotten. A lot of people just forget about the Montreal Olympics, in part because of the Olympics that followed, and of course Moscow and LA being really big showpiece events for the Soviet and US government, and then later Olympics as well, and with the growth of the international globalization and opening of borders and the end of the Cold War, the Montreal Olympics doesn't get fondly remembered. It's more of like an embarrassing stain upon Canada. For the people of Quebec, people of Montreal, and the Canadian public in general. Whereas Calgary in '88 is fondly remembered. Of course, you get a film out of that. You get Cool Runnings. There's a lot of good stories out the Montreal Games. The Saddle Dome was used as an Olympic venue. It's still used today, although it is in the process of being replaced in Calgary. The Vancouver Games, Winter Olympics. The ice hockey final between Canada and the US is one of the most watched Olympic events of all time globally. Again, very fondly remembered in Vancouver. I watched those Olympics religiously. Of course, the Calgary Games was a year before I was born, but I even at my age, I know about the Calgary Games and the legacy of the Calgary Games, the positive legacy of the Calgary Games. The Montreal Olympics doesn't get talked about at all, really. It's a forgotten Olympics in a way. And it was an Olympics that had a lot of negative connotations, where other Olympics also, like Rio and Athens, have also fallen afoul of massive cost overruns, issues with construction, and white elephants. The main stadium, for example, is still an issue today in Montreal that the city and provincial government has to deal with, because they haven't got an anchor tenant. And could they get, the Montreal MLS side, formerly the Montreal Impact, now Montreal CF, back into the stadium? Potentially. It's not being used as part of the World Cup in 2 years' time with FIFA, so it's not getting used. Yet there are events held in the stadium, and occasionally Montreal, the MLS side with Montreal, will play games there. The Canadian Football League, the Montreal Alouettes, will occasionally play games there, but it's not hasn't got a regular anchor tenant. The Expos have gone over 20 years ago, and it is a white elephant. And I think this is an issue that the IOC are going to have to face with coming Olympics as well. We've seen a lot of issues in more modern Olympics. Athens and Rio really come to mind with massive cost overruns. And both those cities are still feeling the effects of those Olympics. Athens is still feeling the effects of the 2004 Games. Rio, very similar, still feeling the effects of 2016. Admittedly, some of the facilities used were also used, with the World Cup 2 years prior. But again, those cost overruns and not really benefiting the people of those cities. So it's interesting, and I thought it'd be worth a quick look at the 1976 Montreal Games. It doesn't get spoken about a lot, and it's not a well-remembered Games. It went wrong for all the wrong reasons, well over budget, labour unrest, national boycotts, and the legacy of the Olympics. Underused facilities, including the main stadium. The Montreal Olympic Tower not being completed for 11 more years. You can see where I'm going with this. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts on the Montreal Olympics. If you are an older viewer, do you remember those Olympics fondly or not fondly? And what other Olympic games should we cover where we talk about the pros, the cons? Was it worth the Olympic legacy? Is the debt being paid off? Did it actually make any money? Because most Olympic games actually lose money. That's something that has been proven is Olympic Games in the short term lose money. So it'd be interesting to see how much money Paris makes, considering they were very budget conscious and trying to use as many existing facilities as possible. And they were very, very budget conscious. And the Paris Olympics has cost far less than the Montreal Games in real terms. So that's going to be interesting to see how much money the Paris Games makes back after the bidding costs and the infrastructure costs. Does it actually make any money? Does it make have a less debt than Montreal? Be interesting. But anyway, thank you very much for watching. Place your thoughts in the comment section below. I'll have some more content for you guys very, very soon.